Okay, I think we are about to start, and I want to welcome you. Thank you for tuning in to our webinar today. It's the first webinar for us to hold in 2025, and we are really excited about the topic. We're going to talk about machine translation and machine translation literacy. And with us today will be Lynne Bowker, professor and expert when it comes to machine translation literacy. My name is Maya. I'm one of the co-founders of Care to Translate and CEO, and I will introduce the topic a bit more, and let's have a look at the agenda for today. So the webinar will cover a brief introduction to the topic, the need for digital translation tools, and I will be zooming in a bit on the healthcare sector, but I know that there are a lot of sectors where digital translation is used and needed. So if you're not working in the healthcare space, stay with us because you will learn a lot about machine translation today, no matter if you work within the healthcare sector or not. I will give a brief intro to the Care to Translate app in case that you haven't heard about it yet or tried it yourself, to give you some insights in how it can and is used in the healthcare sector today. And then it's time for the main point, a main talking point today, where Lynne Bowker will be telling us more about machine translation and machine translation literacy. And I'm sure you're all really excited about that, and to give you the opportunity to ask your questions or share your own insights and comments. You can use the chat to ask your questions. And if somehow the chat does not work for you, please make sure to raise your hand afterwards. After Lynne has presented a bit more about machine translation, we can also unmute you and let you speak, of course. And as a token of our appreciation and for thanking you that you're joining and tuning in here today, we have an exclusive offer where you get 60% of the price if you want to trial our app. So stay tuned until the end if you want to make use of that offer. All right, so let's start. And the topic of machine translation is a really important topic for us at Care to Translate, because it was the reason why Care to Translate even existed in the first place. And the situation that we experienced when starting the company and building the product was that when you worked in the healthcare sector, and in Sweden, we're based in Stockholm, Sweden, you have access to interpreters. And of course, it's great to have an interpreter by your side, especially in medical conversations. But even though there is access, the access can be quite limited at times. We know that, for example, weekends and nights is not always guaranteed that you get the interpreter you need. There's somewhat a lack of flexibility to schedule the interpreter for a certain amount of time or keep them longer than you initially had planned. And also there can be quality issues because not all interpreters are medically certified interpreters. And of course, that affects also the conversation. And to give you just an example from Sweden, and Sweden is a small country, we have about 10 million inhabitants. I have listed some of the languages that are used most frequently here in Sweden. For example, we need to translate a lot into Arabic or Finnish, Somali, for example. And the number you see in front of the language indicates how many persons in Sweden are medically certified interpreters. So there are quite a few people that actually can be present in your doctor's or healthcare professional patient conversations that have the medical certification to interpret in that language. So that was the starting point. And of course, when we started off about 10 years ago, machine translation existed. It has existed for a long time. But the issue we saw were basically two. One is that it does not always guarantee that the translation comes out correctly in the other language. And usually you have no way of verifying it because you use the tool because you don't speak the other language, right? So it's really hard to understand the quality of the translation. And then the other side of the coin is that if you use those open and freely available tools, you cannot guarantee patient or personal data security and safety. And that's also a really important thing in the healthcare and care sector. So those two problems we saw. So that was when Linus, one of the founders and doctor, started to think about what could he do to overcome his language barriers in a safe and secure way. And he started off by writing down the most important phrases that he wanted to communicate to his patients on a piece of paper. And obviously it was laminated and was spread in his department and was a better solution than having nothing at all. But of course, the scalability is quite limited of this piece of paper. So adding new phrases or new languages were a problem. So that is why Linus decided to build an app where he could put all the phrases he had on the paper and even more, and also translate to more languages. And the benefit of this app was that you could also add the sound to the translation. And the sound, to be able to hear, can be really important because not all patients can actually read well, or maybe in a certain situation are not capable of reading something. And that was the birth of the app and the birth of Care to Translate as a company 7 years ago. And for many, many years, this was the core product. And we worked quite intensively on making the phrase library covering as many areas as possible and adding new languages to the platform. And a lot of customers and users appreciate the product a lot, and especially in routine care, where you have your fixed phrases and maybe ask the same things or give the same kind of instructions to your patients. This app has worked really well. But we could also hear some of our users commenting on, despite having great use of the app, there was something missing. So how can we, for example, understand what the patient answers if the patient answers something else than just yes or no? Or how can we hear if the patient has some additional questions or worries? We cannot understand them just by using those pre-built phrases. So we understood that the flexibility of machine translation and making it possible to broaden the scope of the use was quite important. And that is why we're very excited to be launching a voice-to-voice translation feature in our app. And to give you a bit more detailed information, Care to Translate is an app that can translate medical content and is used by medical experts and patients to communicate. And the core, as I just explained, is our phrase library with thousands of pre-verified phrases in 47 languages. And all the translations in text and sound have been validated by humans who are medical experts and native speakers of these languages. So here you have really high quality translations at your fingertips. And this library can be used on your mobile phone, tablet, even on a desktop, and even in offline mode. But in addition, now you also have the possibility to use real-time translation feature that covers over 130 languages. And that's an optional add-on, but we can already see that it's highly requested by our new and existing users and customers. The best of it is that we have built the entire product to not store any patient data. So you're still safe to use it in a healthcare or care setting. So I wanted to give you a quick demo of the app. It's not going to be all of the features, but just to give you a glimpse of how it works. And this is just an example to show you, for example, how you could use it in a healthcare center. For your account, you can build your own playlists that are following the patient journey. And each playlist is symbolized as one of those blue icons. To open one of the playlists, you simply click on the playlist, and then you can see a set of phrases that are structured in the order how you would communicate with your patients. So let's say you are at the reception and you're welcoming a patient. Then you have a set of phrases you can use to talk to them and, for example, to ask them, have you made an appointment?
Чи домовлялись ви про зустріч?
In this case, I had chosen Ukrainian, and here I can ask the patient, have you made an appointment? And I can also let the patient point on the answer to answer yes, for example. And then I can go on and ask the patient, please show me your ID card.
Будь ласка, покажіть мені своє посвідчення особи.
I also have the possibility to show some images to make my question or statement a bit more clear. So this is basically how you use the app. Of course, you can choose what language you need to translate to. And let's just pick another language that also differentiates in how you speak with female or male patients. So in this case, you would choose the gender of the patient to be more cultural appropriate. And now you're back in the same list and you can ask the same questions.
Haben Sie einen Termin gebucht? Bitte zeigen Sie mir Ihren Personalausweis.
And this is basically how the app works. Of course, you can search the library. You can, for example, ask the patient, try to explain what happened, and then you can just insert the first words or one word to get the hits that you need.
Versuchen Sie zu erklären, was passiert ist.
And in this case, of course, it will be hard to understand the patient if they just speak freely without any ability to translate. So this is when the live translate feature comes handy. And what we have also done to frame it is to make you aware that you're now leaving the quality assured library and entering a machine translation space where you can type your texts or also use your voice to translate. And just to show you again, you can type the same question, try to explain what happened. And here I can also play the sound.
Versuchen Sie zu erklären, was passiert ist.
And now I can let the patient speak into the microphone, for example. Ich bin mit sehr starken Kopfschmerzen aufgewacht. And the patient had a really bad headache and woke up this way. And then you could, for example, ask them, do you have any other symptoms? Do you have any other symptoms? And again, I can let the patient explain. Mir ist auch sehr übel. So this is how we think that the app is coming to the best use. Use our pre-validated library for standard and routine care, but move over to the live translation section when you need some more information from the patient. Yes, and now I'm going back to our presentation. Second. So just to summarize, our app provides the pre-validated phrase library with really high quality content, well curated, but also quick access to those pre-built templates that can save a lot of time in routine care. And in addition, we have the real-time translation, text to text, voice to voice, that can help you understand patient questions and answers better, handle unforeseen situations, and of course, also broaden the use of the app throughout your entire organization. And the app can be used before, after the human interpreter has been there, for example, to register in the reception or ask important patient safety questions, or maybe in mammogram scans where you usually don't have the interpreter at hand at all. It can be used to inform and instruct the patient. Patients who are staying at the hospital for maybe several days, you can still talk to them, calm them, inform them what's happening, or before discharge, give them information. And of course, we also have customers who are not in the healthcare sector, but maybe in the care sector. And here it can be really useful as well. In addition, we see a really good opportunity to also onboard and train staff members that might not be proficient in the native language. So this becomes also a tool for the staff to be able to work and be onboarded faster. So that was really briefly about Care to Translate. And now I'm excited to welcome Lynne Bowker. Welcome, Lynne. And hello.
Hello. Thank you for the
Hello.
invitation. I'm excited to be here.
Yes, and we already had some collaborations, and we are really excited about what you are working with as well, and you will tell all of us more about that. But before you start with your presentation, just briefly tell us, who are you and what do you work with today?
I am Canadian. I am a certified translator, and I am also a professor of translation. I work at the Université Laval in the French-speaking part of Canada.
That's so exciting. And you are especially interested in the space of also machine translation literacy. How come you started looking at this space and working with it?
Yeah, as you mentioned, Maya, translation technology, although it's very visible at the moment, is actually has a very long history. So I've been working with translation tools in various forms since my master's degree in the early 1990s. So this is a long-standing kind of interest and passion for me. And of course, the technology has evolved tremendously. So I've seen it go through many different phases, but I still find it fascinating.
And why do you find it fascinating?
I think because it has so much potential. There's really potential to help break down some of these language barriers. As you say, sometimes it's not a case of seeking to replace people, but to support people and to broaden the reach of what we can do. People can only be in so many places at once, usually just one place at once. And so that this technology can really help us broaden our reach and offer support to a greater number of people.
And that aligns so much with our vision and why we do what we do. So I'm really happy you joined the webinar here today. And now we're really excited to learn more from you. So please take it away and share your presentation.
Hey, thank you. Does that look good for everyone?
Perfect.
See the screen? Okay. Well, as Maya has said, I am a person who works with machine translation tools, and I've become interested in something that I call machine translation literacy, which I'm going to explain and explore a little bit with you now. First of all, just very briefly to say, when I talk about machine translation, what am I talking about? Well, machine translation is a technology that actually does the translation of the text. There are lots of tools out there that can support people, where people still remain in the central role. So things like dictionaries or the phrase bank that Maya has described. But when the tool actually tries to do translation, that's when we're talking about machine translation. And probably the best known example out there is Google Translate. This is an example of machine translation technology. And as we just mentioned, this machine translation has a long history. It dates back to the period just after the Second World War. And in the initial phase of development of machine translation, the computer scientists at that time were really trying to almost imitate, in some ways, how people process language. So they built these tools using linguistic knowledge. There were very large bilingual dictionaries, there were complex systems of grammar rules. But of course, we as people know that when we are talking, communicating in any language, we use a lot more than just vocabulary and grammar, right? When we are trying to have a successful communication with someone, we often need to rely on our real world knowledge. If we're talking about a specialized type of knowledge, we need to understand that domain. So in the case of healthcare, we need to understand the concepts involved in medical knowledge. We also know that language often comes as part of a parcel with culture, right? And if we're wanting to talk to people who speak another language, we also might need to have some cultural sensitivity there. And of course, the context of communication. You know, if talking to a friend is not like talking to your boss or talking to a patient. So we have context of communication. And all of these things build into the success of a communication act in any language. But the challenge is that computers don't understand any of these things. Computers have no real world knowledge. They don't have any cultural sensitivity. They don't even understand the concepts in a specialized domain. They can process language, by which I mean they can look for patterns, they can count frequencies, but they don't understand the text, and they have no real world knowledge at all. So this early approach to machine translation kind of didn't go very far. They had a very limited success with it. Now, if we fast forward a bit to the 1990s, 50 years later, after the first idea for machine translation, we found ourselves in a very different technological landscape. And I'd like to point out three things that really have influenced the way that machine translation works today. The first is that by the 1990s, the hardware of computers had advanced a lot. It was cheaper, it was faster, it was smaller, it had a lot more storage capacity. So the technological hardware advancements were quite different than those original computers in the 1940s and 50s. A second development that came in the late 1980s and into the 1990s was that people started using word processors. So things like Microsoft Word or Office, those kinds of tools to produce their texts, right? In the past, we were handwriting or maybe using typewriters, but once word processing really became established, people started producing texts in electronic form. And once the texts are in electronic form, that text becomes a type of data. And the third important point was that we also saw the emergence in the late 80s and early 90s of the internet and the World Wide Web. And that made it possible for us to share information more easily and to access information more easily. So those three factors, better hardware, producing text in digital form using word processors, and sharing and accessing information on the internet, made it possible for the computer scientists to just rethink the underlying approach to machine translation. So instead of basing it on linguistics, instead of trying to imitate how people kind of interact, they kind of threw that out the window and said, let's look at what computers can do really well. And some of the things that computers can do really well include pattern matching. So looking for a repeated pattern, a phrase or, words, and number crunching, which basically means, rapid calculations, being able to count things, being able to compute probabilities. But you'll notice that even though they're very good at these two tasks, it still doesn't involve understanding the text, right? So they're processing the text, but not understanding it. So this is the state we're in today. We have what are called data-driven approaches to machine translation, which includes AI tools. They are data-driven tools, so they're processing language, but they don't understand it. And that's an important point that I'll keep coming back to. So where are we now? In our current situation, I would say it's complicated. On the one hand, we have translation, which itself as a field is not really well understood by people outside that field, right? So if you don't have a background in translation, if you have no training in translation, you probably have only a limited understanding of what's involved. And so there are quite a few misperceptions out there about the process of translation and about the skills needed to really produce a good translation. And I mean, this is understandable, right? If translation's not your field, why would you know everything about it? So it's not a case of judging people who don't know much about translation, but more just an observation that if this is not your domain, your understanding of it is probably quite limited. Just like if medicine is not your domain, your understanding of that is probably quite limited. That's normal. The challenge, though, is that professionals make it look easy. That's their job, right? So when you see someone who's a professional interpreter or professional translator, they probably make it look easier than it is, right? But I am here to tell you that translation is actually quite complicated. And this situation has been exacerbated a little bit by the uh, widespread presence now of machine translation. Machine translation now is very easy to access, right? In the 1940s and 50s, before the internet, it wasn't easy to get machine translation tools, so nobody was using them. But now that they're available on the internet, they're quite easy to access. They are, at least from a monetary perspective, they are free, right? And though it's important to recognize that the free tools are very generic tools, they're not specialized or customized in any way, and free in the sense of not paying money for them, but you do actually have to give your data to these companies, so that may not be free in another sense. But they're definitely convenient. They're sort of available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as long as you have an internet connection. And they're very easy to use. From a user perspective, all you have to do is really copy or type a little text, paste, click. These are not tools that require a thick user manual to help you figure out which button to push. So from a user perspective, they're very easy to use. So this situation makes it very tempting to use machine translation, right? They're free, they're easy to access and use. Why wouldn't we use them? And the question about why we wouldn't use them is linked back to that first part, that maybe if you don't understand some of the intricacies of translation, you might not realize why these tools have certain limitations. So the message that I have for you is that there is no free lunch here. Yes, the tools can be useful in some circumstances, but it really pays to be aware and understand a little bit about what their strengths and limitations are so that you can use them in a responsible way. So this situation where we have machine translation all around us and it's very easy to access and it's very tempting to use it has really emphasized the need for us to develop a kind of literacy. And I call it machine translation literacy. It involves a little bit of information literacy, digital literacy, AI literacy, data literacy. But essentially, if we boil it down, what it is it's about being responsible, being informed, knowing enough about the tools to make good decisions. So it's a cognitive process rather than a sort of techno-procedural one, right? It's not about getting that manual and learning which button to push. It's about asking yourself, should I use machine translation for this task? Is machine translation the right choice here? And if it's not, what are my other choices? So Machine translation literacy really involves a component of risk assessment. It's about understanding what's a good application for machine translation and what's maybe not a good application for it. And this is often tied to the question of risk, or maybe we could frame it as consequences. If the consequences of a bad translation are serious, then maybe I shouldn't be using machine translation. If the consequences of a bad translation are not that big of a deal, then it's more reasonable to use machine translation. So it's about this kind of assessing the risk and the consequences of using these tools. And we have to do that every time we set out to use them because every scenario is a little bit different. And Maya even showed you in the demo that there could be, some use cases that are like asking a question, did you make an appointment, versus, what are your symptoms? Those seem to be different sort of categories of, the consequences of the bad translation could be different in those cases. And the question of privacy and confidentiality comes up as well, especially when you're using the free generic online tools. You really don't have any privacy or confidentiality there. The information that you enter into Google Translate is retained by Google and they can reuse that data. So when you're doing a free online tool, the privacy and confidentiality is not there for you. Another thing to think about with machine translation literacy involves transparency and informed consent. Do people know that a tool is being used to produce this translation? Are they aware? Because that might impact how much they trust the translation, knowing that it came from a person or was validated by a person versus just straight machine output. And so it's important to be transparent about the use and to ensure that the people who are engaged in the communication via machine translation are okay with that they understand the risk involved. And of course, machine translation literacy also has a component that involves, learning how to work with machines in a meaningful way. So human-computer interaction. How can we maybe set the machine up for success by the type of content that we provide for translation? And how might we need to step in and be prepared to do some human work at the end of the process, such as validating or verifying the output or editing it if necessary? So all of these different components can be part of our machine translation literacy. In terms of what I think you need to really know about AI translation tools, I only have a short amount of time to make a presentation, so I really had to boil this down. But if I could pick the one thing that I think is important for people to understand about AI translation tools, I would say that it revolves around the data. And as I said, these are data-driven technologies, and we could look at data as being sort of like the fuel that these tools need to operate. So most of you are probably familiar with cars, either you're a driver or you've been a passenger. You understand that to get a car to perform, you need to know that it has to have fuel, right? So if the car has no fuel, it doesn't do anything. But it's not enough to know that it needs fuel. You have to know how much fuel to give it in order to be able to drive a certain distance, or you need to know what type of fuel to give it in order to get a good performance out of it. If it's a car that needs diesel fuel, you don't want to put gasoline into it. If you have an electric car, then you need a different type of fuel altogether than if you have a gasoline-driven car. So understanding a little bit about the fuel of these AI tools can help us make good decisions about them. So we're going to talk about data and consider data as being a fuel for AI translation tools. And I'm going to play a little game with you very quickly. What these tools operate on is they use a technique which is called machine learning. You've probably heard of machine learning. And again, if I could reduce machine learning to its sort of just the bare essentials, it has about 4 steps to it. The very first step when you're designing an AI tool is that you need to decide what task to give it. So AI tools can perform lots of different tasks, but we have to train the tool appropriately for the task at hand. So some of the AI tools can be used to generate images, draw pictures for you. Other tools can be used to translate, right? So those are two different tasks. So the first thing you do in machine learning is you identify a task for your tool. Then you show it examples, right? You have to give it examples of how to accomplish that task. So if you want it to draw something, you might show it some pictures. If you want it to translate something, you show it examples of texts that have already been translated. The third step is to give the tool a little bit of feedback. So you might just confirm for the tool, I'm showing you an example of a translation and I'm confirming that it's a good translation, something that you can learn from. And then the final task, the final step in the machine learning is to test the tool to see if it actually can perform the task properly based on the training that it received, based on the examples that you showed it. So those very four steps, let's just play a little game and pretend, everyone, that you're an AI tool. Now, the task that I'm giving you is not translation, because translation is very complex, as we've established. But let's try something a little bit simpler, just to have an idea of what happens in machine learning. So the task that I'm giving you is a task of image generation. I'm going to ask you to draw a picture. And in fact, I'm going to ask you to draw a picture of a banana. Let's keep it simple so that we don't have too many things to learn, okay? So the task is to draw a banana. The first step is to give examples of bananas. So if I want you to draw a picture of a banana, I'm going to show you some pictures of bananas. And then I'm going to give you some feedback and say, yes, these actually are bananas. This is what bananas look like. Okay, so that's our training and our feedback. Now the test part. If you are a tool and I give you a prompt, draw a banana, if the training has been done correctly, you should be able to draw a banana. So if you have a pen and paper handy, draw a banana very quickly based on the training that you received. If you don't have a pencil or paper, just imagine a banana. And because we don't have a lot of time, I'm just going to keep going and say, here's my banana. I drew this earlier. Now, people are smart. I want you to remember that. People are smart, machines are not. What do you think happened when that prompt was given to an AI tool? And this is a real example. It's from a few years ago, but it's a real example. What happened is that the tool was incapable of producing a picture of a single banana, right? The prompt was to draw a banana, but in testing the tool, all of the examples that were produced by the AI tool were bunches of bananas, pairs of bananas, never a single banana. And this has become known now as the lone banana problem. And we're applying it here to images, but you can imagine that the same thing would happen no matter what task I set for an AI system. If my training was somehow just a little bit off, the tool has no common sense. It has no ability to compensate for anything that's not in the training data. So we ended up with pictures of bunches of bananas or pairs of bananas. Now, the nice thing about this is that it's easy to fix. We could go back into our training data, we can add some pictures of just individual bananas, and we make sure that that's part of our training data. The problem is that it's easy to fix after the fact. And we have to wonder how many other problems are lurking in our data set that we just haven't discovered yet, and we won't discover until there's a mistake. So this lack of relevant training data and an inability to understand, I'm not sure how my word got cut off there, but this lack of training data, of relevant training data, and an inability to understand are what cause problems for machine translation. For all AI tasks, but including machine translation. So my final slide is to tell you, how does this banana example relate to translation? Well, the first thing that I'm going to emphasize is that if there's no training data, right, if there's no fuel, the translation tools are useless. So we can have the best algorithm in the world, but if there are no examples or no good examples, not enough good examples, then the tool doesn't perform well. Okay. And each tool is trained with different data. That's why you get different translations from DeepL versus Google Translate versus Sistran. Each of these tools has been trained with different translations, different examples. Many of the problems with data-driven tools are a result of poorly selected data, not poorly designed algorithms. So when we think about translation, what do we need in order to teach a machine to do translation? We need a bilingual parallel corpus. That means we need examples of texts that have already been translated to use as examples. And we want them to be good examples. So we want them to be texts that have been professionally translated. And unlike people who can learn from a few examples, my training of you earlier had just 3 pictures of bananas. But in reality, these tools, because they're not smart, they don't understand, they just look for patterns. They need a lot of examples. And I'm talking millions and sometimes billions of examples. So we need a lot, and this is easier for some languages than for others, right? We can find a lot of good quality translations between languages that are very widely used in the world. So I live in Canada, and here English and French are 2 official languages. It's quite easy for us to get examples of English and French texts, but not for all types of texts and not on all topics, because some topics are just not very common. They're very specialized, like healthcare is a good example here. So I could get a lot of examples in Canada of government type texts because our government is officially bilingual. We can get those kind of administrative texts quite easily. But it's harder to get specialized texts, and it's harder to get specialized texts in languages that have a small number of speakers. So again, in Canada, we have a number of Indigenous languages where the number of speakers is much smaller than the number of English or French speakers. So for those languages, it's quite challenging to get the right data set together in terms of both its size and its relevance to a wide variety of topics. So as we start to think about this, how easy would it be to get a corpus of Greek to Turkish translations on the topic of nuclear reactor maintenance? There's probably not billions of examples of that lying around. So we call these high and low resource situations. A high resource situation means it's easy to get high quality examples and a lot of them. And a low resource situation means it's very challenging to get a lot of high quality examples. And so the performance of a tool depends on this fuel, on this data. So if you are somebody who's working between high resource languages and on a very common topic, your experience of machine translation might be quite positive. But when we're talking about less widely used languages or less languages that have less translation activity between them, and the topic is much more specialized or the type of text is much more specialized, then it's difficult to get a sufficiently large and high quality corpus. So the experience of that person using the same tool will be quite different. And I'm going to end it there because I think it would be nice to have some time for discussion. And if you ever want to contact me afterwards, you can drop me an email and I'd be happy to chat.
Thank you so much, Lynne. We should have booked 2 hours with you. I have so many questions as well, and we have already some questions also in the chat. I'm going to read one really quickly, and then we're going to wrap up. So
Okay.
if you guys want to ask more questions or stay in, you are welcome to. If you need to leave, put your question into the chat, and we'll follow up afterwards. There was one question: what will be the role of literary translation in the concept of machine translation? How is going to help us AI tool? I'm not really. Do you understand what's meant?
Yes, I think historically, because we're talking about pattern matching tools, these tools have tended to perform better for texts that are quite formulaic or repetitive. And the more creative the text becomes, the less likely it is that we're seeing language repeated, right? It's more original, and we are using machine translation for literary translation now, but I think it's being used in a slightly different way. I think the translators are using it more for inspiration and less to actually produce a translation. So it's a helpful tool. We can ask ChatGPT for inspiration, and that doesn't mean we have to kind of faithfully take every suggestion it gives us, right? So I think at the moment, the tools still work better for formulaic texts.
Right. Thank you so much. And we have also some questions regarding our tool, but I will answer them, of course. Just looking to the audience to see if you have any more directed questions to Lynne. Otherwise, I just want to kindly remind you to take the chance to get a discount to use our tool if you're interested, of course. Also, here you can reach out to us and Lynne as well, as she also shared just recently. But you can reach out to me as well and to the company. Here we have a question, Lynne, and everybody who wants to stay, please stay on. In a critical situation, like in a conversation between a patient and a healthcare professional, where a language barrier exists and no interpreter is available, would you say that using machine translation is always preferable, or trying to rely on non-verbal communication?
I think we have to look at machine translation as being like a tool in our toolbox. And probably if we are in a situation where we have to rely on machine translation, we don't want to make it the only resource. If we have the option to combine, so, it's we call in research, we call it triangulation, right? If you can have different sort of input that will confirm what you found using a different tool. So try machine translation, but also use body language for sure, because why not? Because, if you get opposite answers from the body language and from the machine translation, then okay, I have to dig a little deeper. I don't think we should say that unedited machine translation alone would ever be a preferred source.
Thank you. Then now the questions are popping up here. Do you have any insight on the new language model DeepSeek and how it works as machine translation? I've read many reviews talking about it being different from how, for example, ChatGPT and Streamline MTs function and are trained.
So I don't have time to give a really good answer to this question. What they're trying to do with DeepSeek is come up with an approach that doesn't require the same volume or type of data. So it's approaching it. It is a different, not 100% different, but it has some differences, and mostly it requires less data and it requires kind of a different sort of training approach. So we don't know a lot about it. It's only a matter of weeks since this came out, and of course, a lot of the information is proprietary. Even in open systems, there are we don't have privy to all of the decision-making process that goes into these tools. So I can't give a really solid answer to that question, unfortunately. But there are some differences with regard to the training and the volume of data needed.
Right, thank you. And maybe the last question to wrap up with, Google Translate is being used quite a lot in healthcare situations in the Netherlands. What would you say, Lynne, to these professionals with respect to quality, privacy, and confidentiality?
Yeah. So the advantages of these free online tools is that they're accessible and convenient. But in reality, they're not free if we think about the fact that they keep our data. So healthcare seems to me to be, well, I guess I shouldn't broaden it to healthcare, but certain aspects of healthcare require a bit of privacy, confidentiality. People might be upset if they realize that their data is being kept by these tools. I don't think there's malice involved. I think really people just don't know some of these things about these tools because, why would they? They're not translators, they're not machine translation experts. So that's the whole reason for machine translation literacy is to try and raise awareness about some of these issues. But no, they're not private. And as I said, the quality can vary quite a lot. It's challenging to talk about machine translation because we can't say it's good or it's bad. It's sort of like in this situation where the risk is low and where the text is not too specialized and where the languages are widely used languages, that's a different scenario than a situation where the text is very specialized, the languages are not widely used, and so we can't talk about good or bad, but we have to think about, is this a good application of the tool? Are the risks in this situation manageable versus another situation where the risks might be very high and we would be less comfortable with the tool. It's unfortunately not a binary answer of yes, no, good, bad, which is exactly why we need machine translation literacy, because we need to help people develop this kind of critical analysis that will allow them to do the necessary risk assessment in the situation that they're in.
Yeah, and maybe that concludes the webinar for today, because this is exactly where we want to join your work, Lynne.
Yeah.
We see the need for more flexible communication. We also see the risks. That's why we have not included it before. But now that we have the function, we really want to guide the user. We want to inform the user. We want maybe to teach the user how to use it a bit more considerate. We have, there is the last question, what are other options for privacy? And so Care to Translate does not store patient data. So this one thing we have excluded, which makes it a bit easier maybe also to implement officially in your healthcare department. And we want to do everything to also enhance the quality. But just as Lynne said, it is hard to talk about quality because different language pairs work differently. There's some with more data and more training, some with less training, the context and so on is important. So that is something that we have big focus on, and welcome also all you professionals in the language industry to help us and to join our forces. And thank you so much, Lynne, for joining us today and shedding some light on this topic, and hopefully also giving all of you that were part of our discussions today some new information. And as Lynne also said, use it, but use it considerate, and reach out to Lynne or to me if you want to learn more. Thank you so, so much. It has been a great pleasure, and thank you especially, Lynne, and looking forward to be working with you.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation and for helping to spread the word.